Welcome back. It's Alan from SpinX Vitality, and today we're doing a continuation of the most important single movement in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yes, you guessed it, hip escape or shrimp out. Hip escape is done when your training partner has you in side control, you're on the bottom, you want to move out to the left, as an example, away from your training partner. My training partner's on my right side, I'm down, I'm framing the shoulder, I'm framing the bicep, and I just plant my left foot down, straighten my right foot out, lean to the side, shrimp out, come back. Hip out, come back. I'm pushing off the leg for the same side I want my hip to go. My other leg, in theory, does nothing. It moves with my body. Hip out, come back. Hip out, come back. Now, you're supposed to come back and regain your guard. In the Masters division, over 30, there's Masters 1 through 7. I'm number 7, do it. Mathematical equation. Every 5 years, you go from Masters 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. If you're good at math, do the calculation. You must hip escape away. As my training partner in New York says, put your forearm under the chin, give him a crack. Give him a crack. So as you hip out, you want to give him a crack and come back. There's no way I'm going to get full guard, especially with my titanium knees. But if I can get my knee inside my training partner's hips, I can use my knee to press out and grow. And now I'm not in side control anymore. I might even be in half guard, and I'll take that. Because as you know, we have sweeps and escapes and submissions from half guard. So here we go. Make sure to hydrate. Very important to hydrate before. And the most important thing, I think, is hip flexion, hip extension. So hip flexion, hip extension, and what I've done is designed a program that I've seen. Nothing is new. I recreated it for Master 7 division. Here we go. I'm going to demonstrate the hip flexion. Your flexion is where you compress the hip. Extension is where you elongate it or grow. So as an example, your feet are on the ground, your hands are behind you. Slide across the mat, and you'll hear that slide. Flexion, extension. Hip, flexion, hip extension. Hip extension, hip flexion, hip extension, hip flexion. Very simple. We'll do a series of movements. Hip extension, hip flexion, extension. That's the game. Train the body for the movement. Train the movement for the body. There's no secret. Just do it. Here we go. I'll do 4 movements. I'll say what each movement is. Flexion, 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 flexion. What's opposite of flexion? Yes, extension, extension, extension. Push your butt back, push your butt back. Hip flexion, 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 flexion. You're going to get core work if you lift up slightly and scoot your hips back for the extension. Knees come in. Lift your hips up slightly, extend. I'm not making any sliding noise. Hips up, extension, hips up, extension. Flexion, hips up, flexion. Hips up, extension. Hips up, flexion, hips up, flexion. Now I'm not going to have my hips up. I'm going to slide on the mat. Listen to the sound for the hip extension. Slide. Hip extension. Hip extension. Hip extension. Hip flexion. Hip flexion. Hear the noise. Hip flexion. Hip flexion. Now we introduce the core by lifting our butt a 1/4 inch off the ground. This is extension. You didn't hear a slide. Extension. 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 hip, flexion, hip, flexion, hip, flexion, hip, flexion. Excellent. Now we'll do 3. Back and forward is 1, back and forward is 2, back and forward is 3, and it's going to be hip extension, flexion, extension, flexion. Here we go. Stay tuned. 1, 2, 3, 4. Flexion, 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 flexion. Extension, hip extension, hip extension, hip extension, hip flexion, hip flexion, hip flexion, hip flexion, hip extension, 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 hip flexion, hip flexion, hip flexion, hip. One more. Let's really go. 1, 2, 3. Wow. 1, 2, 3. Let's pick up the pace. Flexion, extension. Extension first. 1, 2, 3. Flexion. 1, 2, 3. Now imagine I'm on the mats with my training partner. If I can regain or I can move away in defense, away fast, that's fine. If I want to come in and do a double ankle sweep where I put my shoelace behind my partner's ankles, gently push on the knees, boom, they're going to go down. So let's do it one more time. Super speed, I'll do 2 rounds. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Yay! Woo! 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 Next, we have side to side. Hip escape. Feet are down, hands are down. Everything is symmetrical. Lift up, scoot the hips out. Did you see that? Scoot the hips out. Scoot the hips out. Another angle. Watch my right hip is under my shoulders. Now it's off to the side. Off to the side. Off to the side. 1, 2, 3, 4. We could do that, or we can scoot up and down the mat. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Other way. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hip out. Hip out. Hip escape. Hip escape. Hip escape. Hip escape. Hip escape. One more time. Hip escape. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's add a little pace to it. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent!